The winter storm descended on Medicine Bow like a living curse, a beast with teeth of ice and breath that tasted of iron. December wind shrieked through the single main street with such violence that it seemed to possess malice, a sentient fury that hunted the weak and exposed. Sleet pellets struck flesh like thrown gravel, each gust a whip crack that left skin raw and stinging. The coal smoke that perpetually shrouded the town grew thicker in the cold, mingling with the driven snow to create a choking gray miasma that blurred lamplight into sickly halos. Shadows crept from doorways and alleyways, as if the darkness itself were a predator patient and hungry. Caroline Mercer moved through this hell with her children clinging to her like small ghosts. Her dress, thin as paper, clung to her legs with ice, and the shawl around her shoulders, more holes than fabric, did nothing to keep out the cold that burrowed into her bones and made a home there. In her arms, she carried an infant wrapped in every rag she owned, and at her skirts stumbled Thomas 6 and James 4, their faces the color of old brick, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Home was a word that had lost its meaning. What she called home was a leaning shack behind the livery, a structure so flimsy that wind whistled through gaps in the walls and snowmelt dripped through the roof onto the dirt floor. But it was the only shelter between her children and the void, and she moved toward it with the grim mechanical determination of a woman who understood that to stop was to die. The coal wagon came down the grade with the inevitability of an avalanche. The driver was cursing, sawing at the reins, but the horses had gone wild with panic, eyes rolling white hooves scrambling for purchase on the ice hidden beneath the snow. The load was too heavy, the grade too steep, and the wheels began to slide sideways, the entire rig jackknifing toward the edge of the street. In that instant, James slipped. His small boot shot out from under him, and he went down hard, one leg skidding directly into the path of those iron-rimmed wheels, a ton of timber and coal bearing down with the slow, terrible momentum of fate itself. Caroline screamed, but the wind devoured the sound. She lunged forward, her own feet sliding, and in that elongated moment she saw with horrifying clarity that she would not reach him, that she was about to watch her son crushed into the frozen mud, his small body broken beneath iron and wood. Then a shadow moved with impossible speed. A tall figure stepped from the mouth of an alley, and his boots bit into the ice as if he had been born to it. He wore a cavalry scout coat faded to the color of old bruises, and his long black hair streamed loose in the wind. His face was all hard planes and angles carved from something more enduring than mere flesh. He hooked the boy's collar in one gloved hand and wrenched him clear with such force that James's feet left the ground entirely. Then he planted his shoulder against the wagon's sideboard and braced every muscle-locked boots, gouging the frozen street. The horses screamed. The wagons slewed past, missing them by the breadth of a breath, and clattered away into the maelstrom. Caroline stood frozen, her heart hammering so violently she thought her ribs might crack. The man released James, who stumbled back to his mother's side, sobbing. The stranger straightened slowly, ice, clinging to the fringes of his buckskin leggings and the shoulders of his coat. His eyes were steady and unflinching, and when they met hers, Caroline felt something she had not felt in half a year. Not pitied, not dismissed, but seen. Truly seen, as if he recognized in her the same exhaustion and desperation that lived in him. Behind them, Christmas wreaths glowed in shopfront windows, their evergreen branches dusted with snow lamplight, spilling onto the boardwalk in warm yellow pools. It was a festive street, full of cheer and promise for everyone, except the widow who had just watched her child nearly die on it. The man nodded once, a small gesture that carried more weight than words. Then he turned to leave. "Wait," Caroline said, her voice hoarse and raw. "I thank you." He paused, glanced back. His expression revealed nothing, but something in the set of his shoulders spoke of understanding that ran deeper than language. "Get inside," he said quietly. His voice was low and rough-edged, carrying an accent she could not place. Storm's getting worse. And then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling white, leaving her standing there with her children and the memory of hands that had moved faster than fear. 6 months had passed since Caroline Mercer became a widow, and the grief had not dulled it, had only grown sharper like a blade honed on stone. 6 months since the roof of Hard. Harry Bertram's coal mine had collapsed on her husband Amos, burying him beneath rock and timber and the black dust that stained everything in this godforsaken town. She could still hear the knock on the door, the foreman's shuffling boots, the way he would not meet her eyes when she asked if Amos had suffered. He had not answered. Instead, he had handed her a folded piece of paper, a copy of the mine ledger stamped with Harry Bertram's seal. It showed Amos buried in debt charges for blasting powder lamp oil tools' bunkhouse fees. The numbers climbed higher and higher until they swallowed hope whole. Debt passes to the widow, the foreman had said, his voice flat and final. Mr. Bertram's been generous, letting you stay in the shack. But he'll need payment sooner or later. Sooner had arrived faster than she had expected, borne on Harry's calculating smile and clean manicured hands. Harry Bertram owned the mine, the bank, and most of the buildings in Medicine Bow. He was a thick-bodied man with pale eyes the color of dirty ice, and his hands were always immaculate, scrubbed clean every evening, as if the coal dust and blood that built his empire could be washed away with soap and water. He called himself a builder, a man who brought progress to the frontier. What he built, Caroline had come to understand, was a web of debt that caught people and held them until there was nothing left to take. Now she lived in that shack with her 3 children, burning scraps of wood and coal crumbs to keep them from freezing. She washed miners' clothes in water that turned to ice overnight, her hands cracked and bleeding, her back bent with the endless labor. The pay was barely enough to buy flour and lard, and some weeks there was no pay at all, only promises or the insinuation that she should be grateful for the opportunity to work at all. Harry had given her until New Year's Day to settle the debt. After that, he would take the shack. The county agent, a nervous man with spectacles and a leather-bound notebook, had already visited once, hinting in a tone of false concern that hungry children might be better off sent east on an orphan train where good Christian families would take them in and give them proper homes, proper futures. Caroline would sooner die than let that happen. But she was running out of ways to prevent it. The tall Lakota man who had saved James was named Kanji. She learned this from Alma Weiss, the schoolteacher and part-time telegraph operator, a woman who knew everyone's business and most of their secrets. Kanji had once ridden with his people along the Platte River, Alma explained back, when the grasslands stretched endless and the buffalo ran thick enough to shake the earth. Now he hired out as a tracker and translator for the army and the railroad, moving between jobs, never staying long. He's useful, Alma had added, her voice careful, measured. But folks don't trust him. Not really. They remember when he worked on that river survey a few years back. Amos was on that crew too, I think. Something about land up north near the Platte. Caroline filed the detail away, though its significance eluded her. Not yet. Not yet. She saw Kanji around town after that day. He moved with a quiet confidence that set him apart, his buckskin leggings and beaded belt marking him as other in a place where most men wore denim and wool. His cavalry coat was too large in the shoulders, a cast-off from some forgotten soldier, but he wore it like armor. People stepped aside when he passed, not out of respect but out of wariness, the way one might avoid a dog of uncertain temperament. One evening, scrubbing pots in the mine cookhouse, Caroline overheard two miners speaking in low, conspiratorial voices. They did not know she was there, hidden behind a stack of crates in the dim corner of the shed. "Harry's got his hands on everything now," one of them muttered, his voice slurred with drink. Even that riverland Mercer was eyeing. Poor bastard died before he could file the claim. "Heard it was good grazing," the other replied. Railroad didn't want it for track, so it was up for grabs. But Harry made sure nobody else got near it. How'd he manage that? Same way he always does. Books, debts, accidents. Man's got a talent for making problems disappear. They moved on their voices, fading into the smoke and noise of the cookhouse. But Caroline's hands had gone still in the cold, greasy water. Riverland. Amos had mentioned it once months before he died, his voice low and earnest in the darkness of their bed. There's a place up north, he had told her, good grass, clean water. The railroad doesn't want it for track. If I can file a claim, we could have something of our own. Something for the boys. Then he had stopped talking about it, and a few weeks later, he was dead crushed beneath stone that should never have fallen. Medicine Bow survived on coal timber and the Union Pacific Railroad, and each of those industries killed men with grim regularity. Dr. Hugh Calloway was a lean, gray-haired man with steady hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He rode out in all weather to treat injuries, charging what people could pay, which was often nothing. One evening, over weak coffee in Alma's kitchen, Caroline overheard him speaking in a low, troubled voice about a foreman who had gotten drunk and muttered something about bad orders on a blast the day Amos died. Hugh had dismissed it at the time, thinking it was just the whiskey talking. But the words had lodged in his mind like splinters. Sometimes I wonder, Hugh said quietly, stirring his coffee with a spoon that clinked against the ceramic, if that collapse was really an accident. Alma had said nothing, but her expression was thoughtful, her sharp eyes distant. She was a small woman in her 30s, unmarried with ink-stained fingers from the telegraph key, and a mind that catalogued details the way a ledger tracked debts. She kept the town connected to the outside world, one tapped message at a time, and late at night she sorted through old telegrams, cross-referencing names and dates, searching for patterns. She had watched too many widows and orphans pushed out of town, and she was tired of being silent. Roman Doyle was Harry's deputy, a young man who wore his badge like a burden. He had signed on believing in the law and justice, in the idea that order could be imposed on chaos. But he worked for a man who twisted the law to suit his needs, who used Roman's youth and idealism as tools. Caroline had seen Roman's face when he posted eviction notices, the way he pressed his lips together, the way his eyes skittered away from the families he was displacing. He was a man caught between what he believed and what he was ordered to do, and the conflict was written in every line of his body. One afternoon in mid-December, Caroline was summoned to Harry Bertram's office. It was above the bank, a room that smelled of ink and coal smoke and old money. A cast-iron stove glowed red in the corner, turning the air thick and oppressive. Harry sat behind a wide oak desk, his pale eyes fixed on her as she entered. The room was too warm, deliberately so, and Caroline felt sweat prickling beneath her worn dress. "Mrs. Mercer," Harry said, not rising from his chair. His voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it all the more menacing. "Sit." She sat clutching her shawl, feeling the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. He opened the ledger, and turned it so she could see. Amos's name was written at the top in neat, careful script, and beneath it ran long columns of charges. Lamp oil, blasting powder, bunkhouse fees. The numbers marched down the page in orderly rows, climbing higher and higher, until they reached a sum that made her stomach twist. "Your husband died owing me a great deal," Harry said, his thick finger tapping the total with a sound like a judge's gavel. "I've been patient, but patience has limits." Caroline opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand, clean manicured, the nails trimmed and smooth, and silenced her. "There are good folks back east," he continued, his tone suffused with false sympathy. "Families who'd be happy to take in your boys. Give them proper homes, proper schooling. It might be the kindest thing you could do for them, Mrs. Mercer. Unless, of course, you find a way to settle this matter." He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped to something softer, more intimate, and far more dangerous. "You're a clever woman. I'm sure you understand how things work in a place like this. Debts can be forgiven. Arrangements can be made. The threat was clear as spring water and just as cold. Caroline stood trembling not with fear, but with rage so profound it threatened to choke her. She left without a word, because if she stayed she would scream or weep or strike him, and she would not give him the satisfaction of any of those things. Outside the sleet was falling harder, and the wind had teeth. She trudged home with the baby in her arms, and the boys trailing behind their small faces, pinched with cold and hunger. Her legs shook from exhaustion. In an alley beside the general store, her knees buckled, the world tilted edges darkening, and for one long, terrible moment, she thought about lying down in the sleet and letting it cover them all. It would be easier. So much easier than this endless grinding fight. Then a shadow fell across her, and strong hands lifted the baby from her arms before it could hit the frozen ground. "Hold on to my coat," Kanji's voice commanded sharp and clear, and the boys obeyed without question, their small hands clutching the worn wool. He half-carried, half-dragged Caroline through the swirling sleet, his grip firm and unyielding, until they reached Dr. Hugh's surgery. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, shouting for the doctor. Hugh wrapped her in blankets and scolded her for missing meals, for letting herself get so weak that she had nearly collapsed in the street. Kanji stood by the stove, his posture rigid, every line of his body taut with tension. There was anger in him, not at her, but for her, a cold, focused fury that radiated from him like heat from iron. "She needs food," Kanji said, his voice flat and hard. "They all do." "I know," Hugh replied quietly, his hands still working to warm Caroline's frozen limbs. "But food costs money, and Harry owns the only store that'll extend credit." Kanji said nothing, but his hands resting on the back of a chair tightened until the knuckles went white and the wood creaked beneath his grip. Caroline, wrapped in blankets and feeling warmth slowly seep back into her body, looked up at the scout. Their eyes met hers, exhausted and wary, his fierce and protective. And in that brief exchange, she felt something shift. A connection forged not in words, but in shared understanding. "Amos was my friend," Kanji said quietly, as if answering a question she had not asked aloud. "I won't let his family starve." The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried the weight of an oath. Caroline nodded, too tired to speak, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that she was not entirely alone. The next morning, she woke on a cot in the surgery to find an official notice nailed to the door of her shack. Roman Doyle had posted it at dawn before the town was awake, and the paper bore Harry's seal and the careful script of a clerk who knew how to make cruelty sound lawful. Eviction in 10 days. Failure to pay debt will result in seizure of property and possessions. 10 days. Harry had moved the deadline forward without warning, without negotiation. Just 10 days to produce money she did not have, and never would. Roman stood in the street with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, unable to meet her gaze. He looked young and miserable, a man who had imagined himself an agent of justice, and found himself instead an instrument of oppression. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice rough with shame. "Orders?" She did not answer. Did not. There was nothing to say. She pulled the notice down, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her pocket. Then she went inside and fed her children the last of the oatmeal, watered down until it was little more than paste. Kangi heard about the notice from Alma. He stood in the telegraph office, sleet melting off his coat onto the floorboards, and listened in silence. When she finished, he nodded once and left without a word. He walked straight to Harry Bertram's office, each step deliberate, his mind already made up. Harry looked up from his desk, surprised. Few people came to see him uninvited. Kanji stood in the doorway, filling it. "I need steady work," he said. Harry leaned back in his chair, studying him with those pale, calculating eyes. Why the sudden interest, tired of drifting, Kanji replied. It was not a lie, but neither was it the whole truth. You need someone who knows the country. I know it. Harry's mouth curved into a thin smile. I've got work. Payroll wagon runs to the mine coal shipments to the rail yard. Dangerous work. There have been attacks, robbers. I can handle it. Harry's smile widened slightly. I'm sure you can. 50 cents a day. You ride shotgun on every run. It was half what Harry paid his white guards, and both men knew it. But Kanji nodded and turned to leave. One more thing Harry called after him, his voice taking on an edge like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. You work for me now. That means you don't go stirring up trouble with widows and orphans. Understood. Kanji paused at the door, his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly. Understood, he said, and walked out. The first payroll run came 2 days later. The wagon was heavy laden with coin boxes and guarded by a nervous driver and 2 armed men Harry barely trusted. Kanji rode in the back, his Springfield rifle across his knees, his gaze sweeping the road ahead with the methodical attention of a man who had survived by noticing details. The attack came in a narrow cut where black rock walls pressed close on both sides, leaving no room to maneuver. Bullets sparked off stone and rang against iron. One of the horses screamed and went down thrashing in the traces. The driver cursed and hauled on the reins. Kanji dropped flat, dragged the driver behind the wheel hub, and returned fire. His shots were precise, deliberate. He aimed not for bodies, but for positions driving the attackers back into cover. A bullet grazed his upper arm, tearing through coat and skin, leaving a line of fire that made him grit his teeth against the pain. Another shot passed so close to his head that he felt the heat of it, smelled the acrid tang of burnt powder. His heart hammered not with fear, but with the cold clarity that comes when death brushes past and misses by inches. He wrapped the reins around his gloved hand, ignoring the blood soaking his sleeve, and slapped the remaining horse hard. The animal lunged forward in panic. The heavy wagon lurched, slewing around the fallen horse, crashing through a barricade of logs and stones. Wood splintered. Rocks flew. They burst out of the cut into open ground, and the robbers melted back into the rocks rather than pursue into exposed terrain. Back in town, Dr. Hugh cleaned and stitched the wound, while Kanji sat motionless, his face betraying nothing. Caroline had been summoned to assist, and she held the lamp steady while Hugh worked. Her hands did not tremble, but her face was drawn, and she studied the wound with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too much injury. You're lucky, Hugh said, tying off the last stitch. Another inch and it would have hit bone. You'd have lost the arm. Kanji said nothing. He pulled his coat back on the fabric, stiff with dried blood, and stood. As he passed Caroline, their eyes met again, concern in hers, acknowledgement in his. The moment stretched, unspoken, but profound. Why does he do it? Caroline asked Hugh after Kanji had left. Risk his life for Harry's money. Hugh looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, maybe he's not doing it for Harry. That evening, Caroline took a job scrubbing pots in the mine cookhouse. The work was brutal, her hands bled, her back ached, but it paid a few coins each week, and she needed every one. The cookhouse was a low, smoke-blackened building that smelled of boiled meat and burnt coffee. Goethe, the cook, was a sour-faced woman who ruled the kitchen with an iron spoon and a sharp tongue. Faster, Goethe snapped, watching Caroline wrestle a greasy pot into the washtub. Miners'll be back in an hour, and they don't wait. Caroline scrubbed until her arms burned the water so cold it numbed her hands. She had just begun another pot when the shed door banged open and 3 miners stumbled in, laughing, reeking of whiskey. Well now, one said, grinning with yellowed teeth. What have we got here? Caroline's stomach clenched. She recognized the look, Lazy, predatory, the confidence of men who believed they could take what they wanted. She set the pot down and edged toward the door. "Cook wants those pots washed," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "You're in the way." "We'll move the tallest one," said, stepping closer, blocking her exit. "Soon as you're friendly." They closed in hands, reaching breath sour. Her back hit the stacked logs. She opened her mouth to scream, knowing it would do no good. Gerda was half deaf, and the mine was too far away. Then the shed door slammed open with such force it struck the wall. Kangi stood framed in the doorway, one sleeve still dark with dried blood, his face hard and cold as granite. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Cook wants those pots washed," he said, his tone low and edged with steel. The miners froze. They had heard about the payroll ambush, about the scout who had driven off armed men with a wounded arm. They looked at each other, then at Kangi, whose hand rested casually on the knife at his belt, and suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. They shuffled past him muttering and disappeared into the cold. Caroline let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Kangi stepped into the shed, his gaze moving over her face, checking for harm. When he reached for the heavy water bucket, he used his left hand favoring the stitched arm. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "I don't have a choice." Caroline replied, frustration and fear mixing into anger. "I need the money." He nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then I'll walk you back when you're done." It was not a question. She should have resented it, this assumption that she needed protection. But the truth was, she was grateful, and that gratitude sat heavy and uncomfortable in her chest. As they walked back to her shack that evening, the cold air biting at their faces, Caroline glanced at him. "Why are you doing this?" Kangi was silent for a moment, his breath misting. "Because I know what it's like," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "To have everything taken. To be told you don't matter. And because Amos was my friend, I owe him." She did not press further, but she understood. Winter deepened its grip. Coal smoke hung over Medicine Bow like a shroud staining the snow gray. A smallpox scare on a distant ranch kept Dr. Hugh riding day and night. Alma spent hours at the telegraph, coordinating with doctors in Cheyenne and Laramie, while Caroline helped with simple tasks, changing bandages, brewing willow bark tea. Harry posted handbills announcing an auction on New Year's Day. Abandoned property, they said, listing parcels of land buildings, and buried in the middle Caroline's shack and its contents. She tore one down and crumpled it in her fist, abandoned as if she had walked away, rather than been driven out. Kangi began leaving firewood by her back step before dawn. At first, she suspected charity and resented it. But then she noticed the way it was stacked, bark down cut ends, facing the wind, exactly as she did it when she had the strength. It was not charity. It was respect. She started leaving a tin cup of coffee on the fence post, covered so it would not freeze. He always took it, always left the cup rinsed and neatly stacked. It became a ritual, unspoken, but steady, a language without words. One afternoon, when the sky was the color of old iron, Kangi came and told her to bundle the children. They were going to gather firewood before the next storm. "I can't pay you," Caroline said, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Didn't ask you to," he replied. They walked in silence, the boys running ahead, their breath puffing white. Kangi led them to a stand of pines where deadfall lay thick. They worked quickly, dragging branches to a makeshift sled. It was hard, cold work, but honest, and for the first time in weeks, Caroline felt something other than despair. Thomas looked up at Kangi. "Were you on the river with my pa? Ma said he did work on a river?" Kangi paused, then nodded. "Yes. We walked the bank together, marked boundaries. Your father was good at reading land. He had plans for it." "What kind of plans?" Thomas asked. "Good ones," Kanji said, his voice softening. "He wanted to build something for you. A place where you could grow up safe." Caroline looked up sharply, but Kanji had already moved on. On the way back, they crossed a shallow creek, partly frozen. The ice looked solid, but Kanji tested it carefully before stepping out. Halfway across, Caroline's boot punched through without warning. For a terrifying instant, her leg plunged into water so cold it felt like teeth. She gasped, tried to pull back, and the ice cracked outward in a spiderweb. She could feel herself tilting forward, the baby's weight, pulling her off balance, the black water reaching for her. Kanji dropped the sled rope and lunged. He clamped his hands under her arms and hauled her up and back onto solid ice, moving with such speed she barely registered it. Her skirt hung soaked in heavy water already freezing. Her teeth chattered so hard she could not speak, her heart hammering with the terror of how close she had come to dragging her baby down into that freezing darkness. Their faces ended up inches apart, his breath mingling with hers. For a moment, neither moved. His hands were still on her arms, and she could feel the heat of him through her coat. His eyes searched hers, and she saw something fierce and pained, something that looked like old grief surfacing. "You're all right," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I've got you." She nodded, unable to speak. He released her slowly, as if afraid she might fall again, and then stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. He ignored her weak protest and hurried them back to town. Later, thawing in Alma's telegraph office, Caroline learned another piece of the puzzle. Alma pulled out a crumpled wire. "I found this last week," she said quietly. "It's about your husband." The wire was from a railroad lawyer in Omaha, dated 2 years earlier. It mentioned a land survey along the Platte, a strip of river-bottom pasture, unsuitable for track, but good for grazing. Amos Mercer's name was listed as guide and assistant. So was Kangi's. If Amos worked for the railroad, Alma said slowly, he should have been paid. If he had a grazing deal in the works, he wouldn't have been in debt. Not like Harry claims. Caroline stared at the paper, her mind racing. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" "Because Harry owns the records," Alma replied, her voice hardening. "And dead men don't argue. But I'm going to ask the railroad directly. If there's proof, we'll find it." After Caroline left, Alma sat alone staring at the telegraph key. Her hands hovered for a long moment. Then, with a sharp breath, she began to tap. The message went to Omaha, asking for records of survey work involving Amos Mercer and Harry Bertram for documentation of any land claims. It was a risk. Harry had friends everywhere. But Alma was tired of silence. Outside, Kanji walked past the telegraph office and saw the late lamplight burning. He paused, curious, but did not knock. Whatever Alma was doing, it was her business. He walked on, unaware that the wire she had just sent would change everything. Days passed. The cold deepened. Another payroll run ended in gunfire shots so close Kanji felt one bullet pass near enough to his head that the air whistled. He returned fire and drove them off, but the near miss shook him in a way he did not show. That evening, he found Caroline mending by candlelight. He set firewood by the door. As he turned to leave, she called out softly, "Thank you." He paused. "For the wood, for everything," she said. "I don't know why you're helping us, but I'm grateful." Kangi looked at her. In the dim light, her face was drawn but strong, stubborn in a way that refused to break. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "My sister." She had that same look, like she'd fight the world if it came for her children. "What happened to her?" Caroline asked gently. "She lost," Kangi said quietly, his voice heavy. "Soldiers came. She fought. They killed her. took her children. I never saw them again. The silence that followed was thick with shared pain. Caroline understood then why he would not let her family fall the same way. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, then walked into the darkness. Just before Christmas, a blizzard descended with a vengeance that made earlier storms look like rehearsals. It stalled the eastbound stage near the pass, burying the road in drifts taller than a man. The mail was overdue, and Harry was furious. Delayed pay made workers restive, and restive workers asked dangerous questions. Kangji volunteered to ride out with Roman to find the coach. Partly it was duty, partly curiosity. Harry had been pacing his office like a caged wolf, and Kangji wanted to know why. The ride was brutal. Visibility dropped to nothing. Kangji led reading terrain by instinct, while Roman followed hunched against the wind. At one point, Kangji's horse stumbled on hidden ice and went down hard, throwing him. He hit the ground, rolled narrowly, missing the animal's flailing hooves. Pain shot through his ribs. Roman helped him up, both moving quickly before the cold could settle. They found the stage half buried, one wheel smashed, the coach canted at a sickening angle. The driver was dead, neck broken, body already stiff. The passengers, an elderly couple and a young clerk, were alive, but half frozen. Roman scrambled down on a rope. Kangji waded through chest-deep snow to the mail strongbox. The lock was intact, but the bags had split, spilling letters into the white. He gathered what he could, stuffing them into his saddlebags, while the wind tried to rip them away. At one point, the crust collapsed beneath him, and he slid toward a ravine, the world tilting. He jammed his rifle butt into a frozen root and arrested himself, boots scrabbling the drop, yawning below. For a long, terrible moment, he hung suspended, his body screaming. Ice cracked beneath his boots. He thought of Caroline and her children, of promises unspoken, and heaved himself up, inch by agonizing inch, until he reached solid ground. They brought survivors and mail back to Medicine Bow by nightfall. Alma met them at the telegraph office, lamplight spilling into the street. She and Kangji sorted the mail. Most was routine bills, letters, orders. Then Alma pulled out a thick packet stamped with the Union Pacific seal addressed to her. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a typed letter from a railroad clerk answering her wire. Attached was a copy of an old document, the original surveyor's log from 2 years earlier. Hand-drawn maps and field notes described river bottom pasture north of town, poor subgrade for track, decent grass suitable for stock. At the bottom were 3 marks, the engineer's signature, a neat X, beside Kangji's name, and Amos Mercer's inked thumbprint. But there was more scrawled in the margins, were notes in Amos's handwriting, words Caroline recognized instantly because she had seen them in letters he had written her during their courtship. Good water here, sheltered from north wind, space for cabin near cottonwoods. Boys would love it. The handwriting was hasty, excited, full of hope. Kangji stared at the log, his breath catching. He remembered that survey, summer heat dust, Amos talking endlessly about his plans. Then Amos had died, and Kangji had not thought about it again. Until now. Alma sent for Dr. Hugh, who arrived shaking ice from his coat. When he saw the log, his face went pale. If Amos worked for the railroad, Hugh said slowly, he should have been paid, not buried in debt. He pulled out Harry's ledger and compared dates. The survey was completed in June. Amos died in August. The debt started appearing in July, growing week by week, then passed to his widow. This doesn't add up, Hugh said, his hands trembling. If Amos had money coming, why would he suddenly be in debt? Because Harry wanted the land, Alma said, tapping the log. And a dead man can't file a claim. Kangji's hands curled into fists. Harry killed him, he said, his voice flat and cold. "We can't prove that directly," Hugh said, though his expression said he believed it. "But we can prove the debt is false. This log shows Amos worked for the railroad. It shows the land was released for grazing. It shows he had reason to expect payment." He paused, rubbing his face. "I treated a foreman last fall who got drunk and started talking. Said Harry ordered a heavy blast the day Amos died. Wanted to clear more coal. Foreman tried to argue, said the roof was unstable, but Harry overruled him. When the collapse happened, Harry blamed bad luck and paid the foreman to keep quiet." Alma looked at Kangji. "Did you know any of this?" "No," Kangji said, his voice strained. "I was guiding a cavalry patrol. By the time I got back, Amos was buried." They sat in silence, the weight pressing down. The log was proof not just of fraud, but of murder hidden behind ledgers and false debts. "What do we do?" Alma asked. Hugh folded the log carefully. "We take this to the marshal. But first, we make copies. Harry has reach, and I don't trust him not to burn evidence." Kangji stood wincing as his ribs protested. He already knows something's wrong. He's been watching. "Then we move fast," Hugh said. But they were already too late. Harry had a man watching, and by dawn, he knew. Harry Bertram had not built his empire by being slow. The moment his informant reported the late-night meeting, he knew there was trouble. He did not wait to learn what it was. He acted. He stormed into Alma's office the next morning, his face flushed. "I want to see any railroad envelopes from yesterday," he demanded, slamming his hand on the desk. "Now." Alma's heart hammered, but her face stayed calm. She handed him routine notices, keeping the Mercer packet hidden. Harry flipped through them, eyes, narrowed suspicion radiating like heat. "This is all of it?" he asked, his tone dangerous. "That's all," Alma lied smoothly. He did not believe her, but he could not prove otherwise, and after a tense eternity, he turned and left. Not before saying low and threatening, "If I find out you're lying, Miss Weiss, you'll regret it. This town has no use for troublemakers." Alma exhaled, her hands shaking. That night, Harry went to the saloon. He bought drinks, played the generous boss, then casually pulled a scarf from his coat. "Found this near the payroll ambush," he said loud enough for all to hear. Recognized the beadwork, men leaned closer. The scarf had Lakota beadwork, geometric blue and white patterns. "Belongs to that scout," Harry continued, tone dripping false regret. "Kangji, the one hanging around the Mercer widow. Makes you wonder. Man who knows the road, knows the schedule conveniently there to save the payroll after an ambush he could have planned." A murmur ran through the room. Harry leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper everyone could hear. "And another thing. Kangji was on the ridge the day Amos Mercer died. Said he was scouting, but who's to say maybe he and the widow had plans? Maybe Amos was in the way. Maybe they're planning to take what's mine, that riverland. It was a lie built on a lie wrapped in just enough truth to stick." The scarf was a miner's, not Kangji's, and Kangji had been 2 valleys away when Amos died. But Harry knew a crowd fueled by whiskey and fear would not ask for proof. By midnight, a posse had formed Cowhands bounty hunters, and Roman ordered to lead them or lose his badge. Harry told them they could bring the Indian in dead if he lifts a hand. Roman tried to argue. "We should wait for the marshal. Let the law handle this." "I am the law in this town," Harry snapped, stepping close, voice low and vicious. "Now move, deputy, or I'll find someone else for that badge. And maybe I'll take a closer look at that schoolteacher friend of yours. Wouldn't want her caught up in something unfortunate." Roman's face went pale, but he had no choice. He led the posse into the night. They rode toward Caroline's shack, where Kangji had just arrived with firewood, and the surveyor's log tucked in his coat, intending to show Caroline what they'd found. The first bullets ripped through the walls before he could close the door. One tore through Caroline's upper arm, spinning her. She cried out, dropped to her knees, the baby screaming, blood spreading dark across her sleeve. The pain was white-hot, stealing her breath. Dr. Hugh, who had followed to warn Kangji, caught a slug in his side and collapsed in the snow, gasping. Kangji shoved a mattress against the wall. Splinters rained. Caroline, dizzy from blood loss, dragged the boys under the bed and curled around them, trying to shield them. Her vision swam, her arm throbbed, and terror clawed at her throat, not for herself, but for her children. "I cannot do this anymore," she whispered, voice shaking. It was honest exhaustion and the words of a woman at the end of her strength. Kangji gripped her shoulder, gaze fierce. "You carried enough," he said quietly, barely audible under gunfire. "Let me carry your burden." He kicked out the back wall, the rotten wood splintering. He tied a rope and lowered the boys one by one into the drainage ditch. Caroline, teeth gritted, went last, clutching the baby. The descent was agony, every movement sending pain through her arm. She bit her lip, tasting blood. Outside, the posse reloaded, shouting. Roman's voice rose, ordering them to hold fire, but the bounty hunters ignored him. Using darkness and the pause, Kangji led Caroline and the children into the storm. Behind them, the shack burned. Someone had thrown a lantern, and flames leaped into the night. They fled into the timbered hills, the wind driving ice like needles. Darkness was absolute, broken only by the burning shack's glow far below. Kangji half-carried Caroline, his ribs throbbing, the infant bound under his coat. The boys stumbled, fell, scrambled up, their faces white with terror, but they did not cry. They had learned crying did not help. The trail climbed steep and narrow footing, treacherous. Kangji's horse followed, head down, loyal. Caroline's legs gave out. She crumpled. Kangji caught her. "Just a little farther," he said, voice rough. "Stay with me." She nodded, though she was not sure she could. Everything hurt, her arm on fire, lungs burning, exhaustion dragging like weights. But she thought of her children and kept moving. At last, Kangji led them to an old line cabin, half buried in drifts, roof sagging. But there was a stove and cordwood. He kicked the door open, got them inside, struck a fire. Smoke was thick, but heat pushed back the cold. Caroline collapsed on a bench arm, cradled. The boys huddled by the stove. The baby whimpered. Kangji stood by the door, listening. Wind howled, but beneath it, voices distant but growing closer, boots crunching. The posse had tracked them. Blood and footprints made a trail. Kangji barred the door, moved to the window. He peered out and saw lanterns spreading in a circle. Harry's voice rose above the wind. "Mrs. Mercer, send out the scout and you can walk free. You have my word." Caroline's face twisted. "His word means nothing." She spat. Kangji handed her his Springfield, adjusted her grip so recoil wouldn't wrench her wound fingers, briefly closing over hers. Their eyes met. No words needed. If he stayed, they might live. If he ran, they died. Roman's voice cracked, trying to calm the men, but bounty hunters ignored him. One fired, punching through the window. The baby screamed. Kangji made his decision. He moved to the lean-to, pulled a wrapped bundle from his saddlebag, something he'd carried for years but never shown in town. He unrolled it carefully, hands reverent. A Lakota war bonnet. White and black feathers, intricate beadwork catching firelight. It had belonged to his father, taken up after a final council before their band was pushed off the land. In town, he hid it, knowing it would draw bullets. Here in a fight, he might not survive. He set it on his head with slow, deliberate hands. Not borrowed glory. His heritage chosen when prepared to die for people who had become his own. Caroline watched, breath catching. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done long ago," he said, voice calm despite chaos. "Fighting back, For what's right. For your family. For Amos. Earlier, when they'd first taken shelter, Kangji had noticed the terrain above a steep gully where wind had packed snow into an unstable cornice hanging over the approach. He'd marked it the way a hunter marks terrain, knowing it might prove useful. Now, slipping out through a gap where logs had rotted, he moved with purpose. The storm swallowed him. He climbed the slope belly to frozen ground, digging in with rifle butt and boot toes. Wind clawed, trying to peel him off, but he kept moving, ribs screaming, until he reached the gully. Below, Harry's men advanced up the channel, using it for cover. Lanterns cast wild shadows. They bunched together, confident, thinking the scout trapped. Kangji took careful aim at the cornice he'd spotted the overhang of wind-packed snow and ice. His hands were steady despite cold. He fired once. The report cracked sharp. The bullet struck the fragile overhang, fracturing it. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the shelf broke free with a sound like thunder. Snow and rock roared down, swallowing men. Not a giant slide, but enough. Men shouted, scrambling, lanterns flying. One smashed, flared, hissed out. Horses bolted. The posse scattered, attack broken. In chaos, Roman dragged Dr. Hugh, lashed to a saddle behind a tree. Hugh was pale, hand pressed to his side, but alive. Harry, furious and half mad, charged up toward the cabin, revolver in hand. He'd lost control, lost surprise, and now was losing his mind. Breath harsh, he slipped twice, but kept going, driven by fury. Kangji met him on a narrow ledge above the ravine, where wind had left only ice. No duel, no speeches. Just two exhausted men slipping, firing too fast, shots wild. A bullet ripped through Kangji's shoulder, spinning him. Pain, white-hot, vision blackening. He staggered, boots sliding, nearly went over. Another grazed Harry's ribs, drawing crimson. They closed, grappled, boots scraping for purchase. Harry was heavier, used weight to drive Kangji back. Kangji's heel caught. He went down hard, air driven from lungs. Harry loomed, revolver raised. For an instant, Kangji saw death in those pale eyes. Then his hand found a rock, half buried. He swung with all strength left, catching Harry across the jaw. The bigger man's head snapped back. Kangji surged up, ignoring fire in his shoulder, grabbed Harry's coat. They grappled again, spinning near the edge. Harry's boots slipped on smooth ice. He stumbled backward, arms flailing. Kangji had his coat clutched. For a moment, he could haul him back. But if Harry lived, he'd twist the story-berry truth. Harry jammed his revolver toward Kangji's belly movement, shifting weight backward. Kangji released his grip. Harry's boots slid. He toppled, arms, windmilling, shock and fury on his face, vanished into swirling darkness. Distant crash body hitting rocks below, for then nothing but wind. Kangji stood on the ledge, breathing hard, blood running down his arm. His shoulder burned, but he was alive. Below, the posse scattered, leaderless. Roman shouted orders, but most were retreating, unwilling to die for a dead man's crusade. Kangji turned, made his way back, moving slowly, every step effort. When he pushed the door open, Caroline stood by the stove, rifle in hands, face ashen, but determined. Boys huddled behind her baby, quiet at last. She looked at him, blood on coat, wore a bonnet, loose exhaustion in his face, and understood. "It's over," he said quietly, voice rough. She nodded, set the rifle down, moved to help. As she pressed cloth to his shoulder, their hands touched, and for a moment the world narrowed to just them, and fragile hope they might have a future. By morning, the storm had blown out, leaving hard blue sky over white hills. Sun came up cold and brilliant, turning snow to blinding glare. Kangji, war bonnet wrapped and stowed, led Caroline and children down. They moved slowly, baby bundled. Roman and Alma met them halfway, driving a borrowed wagon. Alma helped Caroline and children into the wagon bed, piling blankets, murmuring reassurances. Roman tended a bounty hunter with a broken leg, binding it. Even an enemy was a life, not left to freeze. In Medicine Bow, The town was quiet, subdued. Word of Harry's death spread fast, carried by survivors who wanted no part. Dr. Hugh, pale and bandaged, testified from his sickbed. He told how Harry started the shooting, how Kangji pulled him from the line of fire, how Harry twisted law and ledgers. Harry Bertram was a thief and murderer. Hugh said, voice weak but firm, and I have proof. But the town was not ready to listen. Not yet. Harry had owned too much control too much for too long. Men who owed him, who'd profited, who simply feared, they began to whisper. Maybe the scout planned it. Maybe the widow was in on it. Maybe Harry was right. Alma saw the tide turning and acted. She gathered copies of the log telegrams, Harry's real ledger. She called a meeting in the schoolhouse. Most of the town showed driven by curiosity or guilt or boredom. Roman stood at the front, his badge laid on the table. I wore this badge for Harry Bertram, he said, voice steady despite tremor in hands. I thought I was upholding law. But I was wrong. Harry broke the law every day, and I helped. He pointed to documents spread on the table. This is proof. Amos Mercer was murdered so Harry could steal his land. Caroline Mercer and her children were driven out on a debt that never existed. And Kangji, the man you wanted to hang, he was the only one brave enough to stand for what's right. Silence. Then Alma stepped forward, held up the log, turning it so all could see signatures. This is the original survey log from Union Pacific, she said, voice clear and strong. It proves Amos worked for the railroad, not Harry. It proves the land Harry claimed was never his. It proves everything Harry told us was a lie. She looked around, meeting eyes of men who'd been Harry's friends, employees, enablers. We can let his lies stand. We can let Caroline and her children be driven out. We can let Kangji be blamed for a crime he didn't commit. Or we can do what's right. For once. Silence stretched. Then a miner stood, older man with coal-blackened hands. I worked for Harry 20 years, he said. He shorted my wages every month, told me I was lucky. I believed him. Another stood. Harry loaned me money, then charged interest that doubled the debt. I'm still paying. One by one, people stood. Each had a story. Each had been wronged. And each in silence had allowed it. Roman picked up his badge, set it aside. I'm done working for men like Harry, he said. If this town wants law, it'll be real law. Fair law. The kind that protects widows and orphans, not grinds them down. It was as if a dam had cracked, pressure building for years, suddenly released. The crowd began to murmur, then speak, then shout. Not in anger at Kangji or Caroline, but at themselves, at their complicity, at the injustice they'd allowed to fester, because it was easier than fighting. A federal marshal arrived 2 days later, summoned by Alma's wire. But by then the town had made its decision. The marshal listened, compared log to ledger, interviewed miners and townspeople. Harry's estate, mine bank properties, was seized to cover unpaid wages and fraudulent debts. The real ledger showed truth wages, stolen injuries, covered up deaths, blamed on bad luck. Men who'd worked for years without fair pay were compensated. Dr. Hugh received payment for care provided on credit. Caroline's debt was wiped, erased, as if it never existed. Roman turned in his badge, but the marshal offered him a job as local assistant. After hesitation, Roman accepted. I want to help people, Roman said quietly, young face serious. Not hurt them. Doc Hughes offered to teach me doctoring. I'd like that. Hugh clapped his shoulder. You've got the hands for it, and the heart. We'll make a healer out of you. Alma continued teaching, classroom growing as families drifted back. Caroline's boys showed up in clean but patched clothes, front row, eager to learn. Thomas asked questions about maps and rivers, his father's curiosity alive. James drew pictures of horses and mountains, small face serious. Spring came slowly, pushing snow back. The river north of town ran high and brown, with meltwater carving new channels. Another packet arrived from Omaha, forwarded by the same clerk. It contained a proposed grazing lease the company had once considered for Amos on the river bottom pasture. Never finalized, because word of Amos's debt made him look unreliable. Attached was a note from the engineer who'd signed the log. He'd heard about the trouble and wanted to set the record straight. He remembered Amos and the Lakota scout called Kangji described them as capable and trustworthy men he'd stake his life on. Mentioned a day they'd crossed a flooded creek, chest high and fast, how they worked as a team, trusting without hesitation. Good men, he wrote. The kind you want beside you when going gets rough. Amos Mercer deserved better. Legally, the railroad had no interest in the pasture. The marshal helped Caroline file a claim in her name notation that she planned to support children by cutting hay and boarding stock. Land was rough, muddy banks, willows, narrow meadow, prone to flooding but reachable by wagon road. And grass was rich if worked hard. Kangji, who knew every bend, walked the boundary with Caroline one bright afternoon. Boys ran ahead, chasing over hummocks of new grass laughter carrying. Baby Heavier, now well-fed and healthy, rode against Caroline's chest in a sling Alma had sewn. As they paced the river, Caroline stumbled on a hidden rock, almost pitching forward. Kangji's good hand flashed out, caught her elbow, pulled her upright. For a heartbeat, they stood close, breaths slowing together, river loud around them. Still carrying my burden? She asked, attempting a wry smile, testing if the phrase was only for gunfire and fear. Kangji looked at the children, at the cabin's site they'd have to build, at the long list of tasks ahead: fences to mend hay, to cut horses, to graze winters, to survive. He thought of his father's war bonnet wrapped and stored, a reminder of who he was and where he came from. He thought of Amos dead in a collapse that should never have happened, of a debt that never existed except in lies. "We carry it together," he answered, voice steady and certain. "Not a grand declaration, not love wrapped in poetry. A practical arrangement born of necessity and built on respect." Caroline suggested they work the land as partners. She and children would live on the claim and manage hay. Kangji and any kin who wanted could graze horses and store fodder, sharing profit from selling to railroad and ranches. "It's only fair," she said, voice warm with gratitude. "You saved our lives, gave us a future. This land should be yours as much as mine." Kangji shook his head. "Your husband earned it. I'm just making sure you get what he meant for you to have. No kiss, no romantic embrace, just the quiet decision to share work and risk, to build something honest from wreckage Harry left behind." They stood together at the river's edge, two people who'd survived the worst the frontier could throw and come out scarred but alive. Behind them, Medicine Bow sent up its thin coal smoke plume gray column, rising into clear spring sky. Ahead, the narrow green line of river cut through thawing earth, carving a path towards something that might, with work and hope, become a future. Kangji bent, picked up a smooth river stone, turned it in his hand. He offered it to Caroline. She took it, fingers brushing his, tucked it in her pocket, a small thing, a token, a beginning. Boys ran back, breathless, grinning, asking when they could start building. Caroline laughed, a sound rare, so long it felt strange and new. Kangji looked at her, and something in his stern features softened just a little. "Soon," he said. "We'll start soon." Thomas tugged his coat. "Will you teach me to track?" he asked, eyes wide with hope. "And to read land like you and Pa did." Kangji crouched to the boy's level. "Yes. I'll teach you to track animals, rid weather by clouds, find water in dry country. I'll show you which plants heal and which hurt. Your father would have taught you these things. I'll do it for him." "And me?" James asked, voice eager. "You too," Kangji said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Both of you. You'll need to know how to survive out here." how to take care of this land and your family. But he's gone, Thomas said quietly, expression solemn. Pa's gone. He is, Kangji agreed, voice gentle. But his work isn't finished. We'll finish it for him. Together. Caroline watched them, her heart full in a way it hadn't been since Amos died. This was not the life she'd imagined. It was harder stranger built on ashes and survival. But it was hers, earned through blood and ice, and the simple choice to keep going when everything said stop. As they turned and walked back toward the wagon, side-by-side shadows stretching long across grass, Alma met them on the road. She carried papers in a small basket. Filed the claim this morning, Alma said, handing documents to Caroline. It's official. This land is yours. Caroline looked down at papers at her name, written in clear, bold script. Caroline Mercer, landowner. It felt impossible, like something from a dream. Thank you, she said, voice thick with emotion. For everything. For believing in us. For fighting for what was right. Alma smiled, sharp features softening. Just doing what's right. About time someone did. And I brought you something. She handed Caroline the basket. Inside were seeds, corn, beans, squash, and a small packet of letters tied with string. What are these? Caroline asked. Letters from families who want to help, Alma explained. Word's gotten around. People want to contribute. Seed tools, offers of labor when you're ready to build. This town's got a conscience after all. It just needed a reminder. Caroline's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Alma replied gently. Just build something good here. Show them what courage looks like. Roman rode up on a horseback, Dr. Hugh's medical bag strapped behind his saddle. Doc says you should come by in a few days, Mrs. Mercer. Have that arm checked. I will, Caroline promised. And Roman, thank you. For trying to stop them. For doing the right thing when it mattered. Roman nodded, young face serious. I should have done more. But I'll do better from now on. That's a promise. They stood together, the six of them, Caroline and her children, Kangji, Alma, and Roman, while spring's sun warmed the air, and the river sang its endless song behind them. An unlikely group bound by hardship and choice, stronger for it. That evening, as sun set over hills, Kangji helped Caroline and boys set up temporary camp on the land. They built a fire, cooked beans and bacon. Baby slept peacefully wrapped in blankets. Boys sat close to fire faces bright with hope. Tell us a story, Thomas asked, looking up at Kangji. About when you and Pa walked the river. Kangji glanced at Caroline, who nodded. He settled back against a log and began to speak, voice low and steady, weaving a tale of two men walking a riverbank in summer heat, marking boundaries and dreaming of the future. He told them about the day they crossed the flooded creek, how water had been fast and cold, how they'd worked together, trusting completely. He told them about Amos's plans, his hopes, his dreams for his family. Boys listened, rapt eyes shining in firelight. Caroline felt something inside ease, a knot of grief and fear loosening. These stories would keep Amos alive for his sons, give them something to hold. When the story was done, boys curled in blankets, and Caroline sat by the fire with Kangji. They didn't speak much. No need. No. Silence between them was comfortable, filled with fire crackle and distant nightbird call. Do you think we can do this? Caroline asked, finally, voice soft. Build something here. Make it work. Kangji looked at the fire, then at her. His shoulder still ached from the bullet wound, but pain was manageable, healing. Yes, he said simply. We already started. She nodded, believing him. Stars came out bright and cold, scattered across vast Wyoming sky. River ran on, carving its path through land patient and eternal. Two people sat by a fire, bound by shared loss and shared hope, ready to face whatever came next. I'll teach them everything, Kangji said quietly, breaking silence. How to survive. How to be strong. How to honor the land and people who came before. I know you will, Caroline said. And I'll teach them to read and write, to keep books, to understand law, so no one can cheat them the way Harry cheated us. They'll be good men, Kanji said with certainty. Like their father. Caroline reached out, took his hand, a simple gesture carrying more weight than words. Thank you, she whispered, for giving us a chance, for carrying my burden when I couldn't. He squeezed her hand gently. We carry it together now, he said. From here on, together. Fire burned low, casting warm light across their faces. Baby sighed in sleep. Boys dreamed of rivers and horses and stories their father left behind. And in that moment, beneath endless stars, a new beginning took root, fragile, uncertain, but alive with possibility.